Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. My name is Barbara Falk, and I am the host of today's events. We are here virtually to both celebrate and virtually launch the publication of a new book from Bloomsbury Academic Press, which is entitled Censorship in Czech and Hungarian Academic Publishing, 1969 to 1989, with the wonderful subtitle, Snakes and Ladders. I also want to introduce to you our two discussants, James Krapfl and Padraic Kenney. So without any further delay, what I'd like to do now is to pass the floor over to Libora, and she will begin with a PowerPoint presentation and discussion of her book, and then we will follow with the two discussions by both James and Padraic.
This project has its beginning in the mid-1990s, when I began to teach at a Czech university and became acutely aware that my students who still studied from the same textbooks as I did in the 1980s read those textbooks differently. They took the information in them at face value, gave importance to passages that I never even noticed, considering them as mere fillers with which the authors padded the text here and there to give it an appearance of ideological propriety. In short, I felt that, unlike my students, I possessed a code to the intended reading of these books and was concerned that the code was being lost and erased from memory with every student cohort. The general aim of this project was then to save or retrieve the code for posterity. Inextricably bound with the question how was the question who to talk to. For reasons that I explain in some detail in the book's introduction, I settled on the members of a very broadly conceived gray zone, intellectual elite. So academics who did not belong to the dissent, but neither to the leading lights of official academia, the apparatchiks. I chose people who publish in state publishing houses and journals and or taught at universities during state socialism, and who were respected by their peers at the time of the interview for their work that they did already in that earlier period. In short, people about whom one could say that their loyalty was primarily to their profession rather than with the party. What all of them shared, however, that at the time of the interview, that is in the first decade of the new millennium, they enjoyed position of seniority and respect in the disciplinary communities. Most of them were professors, heads of departments, team leaders, and prolific authors. As I began to interview and simultaneously read theoretical literature on censorship, the core question crystallized. What was the end effect of censorship in state socialist publishing? Did it motivate creativity and critical thinking in devising strategies to avoid acts of censorship and communicate one's ideas to the readers? Or was it the exact opposite? Did the constant checking against the potential censorial interference with one's text prove to be corrosive to creative and critical thinking and writing? How to tell the overall story and preserve the contradictions, and at the same time, not to take a side with my narrative voice. A resolution to the dilemma became an issue of the ethics of representation. In the end, I decided to write the central part of the book in what has since become known as post-academic writing, the kind of research writing that looks for unorthodox and creative ways of representing research findings. I developed a method of research writing that I called imagined conversations, with a bow to Benedict Anderson. They talk about the institutional environment, the personnel strategies in institutions, and their own coping strategies in those institutions. They try to piece together a typical trajectory of an idea through institutions to publication and reception. They contemplate the relationship of authors to their texts and the very concept of authorship in state socialist publishing. They try and recall the specific language used in scholarly texts of the time, as well as decide whether there indeed was some special code used by authors and understood by their readers, but inaccessible to censors. And finally, they reflect on the legacy of the past for the present and its continued relevance. I will not go on about the theoretical conclusions. You can get the gist from the introductory chapter that my publisher generously made available, and I posted for download on both my ResearchGate and academia.edu sites. Instead, I will read 3 short extracts from the imagined conversations. The last extract that I will share with you today continues the discussion on language. This time I asked the participants of the imaginary symposium to reflect on their personal relationship to the language they used in their academic texts. The caterers began to clear away the main course dishes. As we were waiting for the desserts, I invited my mentors to assess the overall use of the scholarly language with the hindsight of the intervening years. I asked, do you think that this practice of using certain authorially preferred or, on the other hand, externally demanded phraseology was always a conscious act, or was it something that had passed so far into the bloodstream as not to register? It was entirely conscious, Professor Sinepis said without hesitation. In my student days, I was incapable of accepting the worldview or ideology that existed. So it may have passed into the bloodstream, but I think it was more a kind of indifference to the fact that such phrases were used. They were seen as more or less formal, empty things that were simply put there. Like when you get a parcel, it's wrapped in padding, just padding that was of no importance, that got discarded anyway. It was a learning process for all of us. Professor Seba confirmed that the situation was similar in Hungary. It started in the secondary school. What is the way to describe things? You were socialized into that, and that was the way how you participated. One of the key features of the dissident literature and key aims of participating in underground activities was to learn a different language and to use a different language. Sometimes it was much less about the topic. It was just about how you address a topic. She fell silent. Nobody else claimed the floor, so she continued, reflecting. I thought about it a lot after the transition, about our language. One very effective tool to stop intellectuals from publishing was depriving them of their language. Another Czech scholar then takes over. An amplifier of terror didn't apply just to actual terrorists. Professor Sorbus brought up his earlier metaphor. But given how authors overuse the phraseology, it's understandable this made others feel obliged to follow them. It created a benchmark. For a long time, I myself had scruples, but at the very end of that period, I did use Marxist-Leninist. Another narrator continues. It occurred to me back then that the young generation was so fixated on music, so overrated the importance of musical expression, the language of music, because they were totally disillusioned, totally fed up with the abuse of language, Dr. Hyacintha offered. Because language had lost its credibility, they needed another medium to communicate with others.
And in my comments, I would like to point out that her book delivers more than the title itself promises. It's a book with relevance to more than just the period of normalization in Czechoslovakia or Hungary at the same time. It's a book with relevance to our understanding of the normalization of unfreedom and dissent, even in our own societies today. I also think that scholars and students will appreciate this book because it develops a highly original method of presenting interview data. Though the book focuses on just one aspect of life in normalized Czechoslovakia and Hungary at the same time, the evidence that Oates-Indruchova presents helps us understand normalization and post-totalitarianism more generally. The work's theoretical implications are relevant far beyond the borders of these countries and not limited to the past, because normalization is a system of power relations that is presently sweeping the globe. Scholars like Kieran Williams and Timothy Snyder have argued, for example, that Americans in the Trump era can learn a lot from studying normalization in Czechoslovakia. And of course, intellectual life in China today can be profitably compared with that of communist Czechoslovakia. We can even see normalization unfolding before our eyes in Hong Kong. Oates-Indruchova also presents a new perspective on dissent, shedding unparalleled light on the gray zone of people who in certain ways resisted, but without sacrificing their careers. People for whom living in truth, to quote Havel, could be morally problematic. Oates-Indruchova describes gated communities of scholars around publishing venues as a sociological response to censorship. Her book further documents, and therefore renders available for scholarly scrutiny, a number of commonly held perceptions that have so far largely escaped systematic assessment because they've been based primarily on personal impressions. For example, that intellectuals in Czechoslovakia became oversensitized to textual content, despite, in practice, minimal textual interference, or that a lack of clear boundaries allowed a scope for negotiation between authors and publishers. And finally, that a kind of schizophrenia became widespread because normalized Czechs could muster no concrete evidence to back up the apparent reality of being blackballed. So the book successfully illustrates and explicates the paradoxes not just of scholarly life in formerly communist countries. We can see many of these sociological processes unfolding before our eyes in what's left of the free world. We can see self-censorship, even in places where there is supposed to be academic freedom, because of what various power holders might think. From China's communist regime to elected governments increasingly brazen about favoring political supporters and punishing critics. Hungary has now become the role model in this regard, but similar tendencies can be seen elsewhere as well. We can also see the psychologically challenging necessity of navigating the divide between one's own perception of reality and an interpretation of reality promulgated by power holders and reinforced by those who, in public, go along, whether out of conviction or out of fear. So Oates-Indruchova's excellent book about the past is, to an uncanny and perhaps saddening extent, also a guidebook for our future.
There is not a vast gulf between those who censor and those who are censored. They know each other, they work in the same world, they're educated in similar ways. Sure, some of them are sometimes somewhat faceless, but in the end, it is a world of we rather than us and them. And very few scholars, it seems to me, have tried to get at that. And there have been a few scholars, especially on the East German side, looking at Stasi or other groups and how they function. But we really do not have enough of this. And here I would point to another shortcoming of the field. Shortcoming is probably unfair, but a limitation so far in the field that I think this book overcomes. So far, the study has been limited really to the philosophers and the poets, which we could say those are they're the tip of the iceberg. Beyond that, we have this whole world of intellectuals who aren't visible, who are definitely beneath the waves and provide a superstructure, perhaps. The teachers and authors upon whom others perhaps build their careers. They clearly can't write for the desk drawer as a poet can or perhaps must. Their work is usually not fit for Samizdat if it exists, or for Tamizdat, except for the very, very few. They are subject to the strictures of censorship, and as I suggested before, they're of course implicated in it as well, not just because they go along with it, but because they are usually of the same milieu that creates censorship. So it's an internalized experience. And what does it mean to internalize the experience of the everyday, of struggling to put out your work, struggling to interact with a readership while having to interact also with the heavy hand of the editor and the state behind the editor. You know, it strikes me that until now, to a large extent, the only guide we've had to this is Czesław Miłosz's Captive Mind, which was published over 60 years ago. And it's brilliant stuff, but it does give us it kind of reduces things to sort of an individual sort of curdling of the, a curdling of the soul almost that comes from having to make individual decisions. We really should have moved on beyond Miłosz by now. I mean, there are a few others who have gone farther. Maria Hirschowicz, excuse me, for example, who's published in English as well as in Polish. But you know, I mentioned these predecessors and the challenges in order to emphasize what a remarkable achievement this book is. We could say, oh, sure, scholarship of the 70s and 80s. Is there really anything interesting to say about that, especially since it was censored? Well, this book shows us that there is something important to tell. The story becomes exciting, in part because we have the scholars telling it in their own words, but secondly, because those scholars have an interlocutor who draws out the story and then ingeniously puts them together around a seminar table, quite logically around a seminar table, so they can interact as I'm sure they would naturally. So a world that would become, that would be otherwise unimaginable becomes not only visible, that underside of the iceberg becoming visible, but also becomes really compelling. But I think that this book raises the opportunity for thinking about the whole person as they experience and encounter Eastern European socialism. And for that, I think we have to be grateful to Libora Oates-Indruchova. Thank you very much.